Welcome, everyone. Get ready. Because today we're doing a deep dive into, well, a really perplexing aviation mystery. We're talking about the first official report on that Air India Ahmedabad plane crash. Now, when this report dropped, it instantly stirred up a massive storm. And here's where it gets really interesting right off the bat. Boeing stocks actually went up, which kind of hinted that maybe the company wasn't seen as being at fault here. The finger, it seemed, was pointing pretty firmly towards pilot error.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly that public narrative shifted. The immediate question that popped up for a lot of people was, hang on, are we looking at an attempt here? An attempt to blame the pilots who tragically aren't here to defend themselves, and is that maybe to shield the companies involved? It really raises fundamental questions about how these investigations work sometimes.
Absolutely. So today we're going to unpack the details of this report. It was published by India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, the AIIB. And just for clarity, we'll be using Indian Standard Time, IST, throughout. That's 5.5 hours ahead of the UTC times you might see in the report itself. Just makes it easier to follow the timeline. Our mission, really, is to piece together the evidence we have so far and explore the different angles on what might have truly happened. Okay, let's set the scene. Back on June 12th at 11:17 in the morning, IST. This Air India plane had just landed in Ahmedabad from Delhi. Everything normal up to that point. But then, while it was parked at bay number 34 before its next flight, a critical issue cropped up.
That's right. A complaint was logged in the pilot defect report. They often call it the tech log. It just said STAB POS XDCR. Now, that's shorthand. It means stabilizer position transducer. Basically, the sensor measuring the position of the horizontal stabilizer at the back wasn't working right. A key control surface.
Okay, so standard procedure kicks in. An Air India duty aircraft maintenance engineer fixed it. And by 12:10 p.m., the aircraft was signed off, cleared for its next flight. Now, the pilots for this leg, they were Mumbai-based. They'd come in the night before, so presumably well-rested. The co-pilot was the pilot flying, the PF, actually handling the controls for takeoff. And the captain was pilot monitoring, the PM.
And it's important to note their status right before the flight. At 11:55 a.m., both pilots passed a breathalyzer test, confirmed they weren't intoxicated, clean tests. Then you have CCTV footage showing them at the boarding gate around 12:35 p.m. The plane itself, it had plenty of fuel, 54,200 kilos, and its takeoff weight was just over 213,000 kilos. That's comfortably within the max limit of 218,000. So no issues there. Everything looked good to go.
Okay, now the critical moments, the crash itself. The timeline laid out in this new report is incredibly precise, chillingly so. At exactly 13:38.39 IST, the aircraft takes off, lifts off the runway. Just 3 seconds later, 3 seconds, at 13:38.42, the plane hit its maximum speed for that phase, 180 knots, and then everything just went completely wrong.
Yeah. Immediately after hitting that peak speed, something critical happened. The fuel cutoff switches for both engines, engine 1 and engine 2, moved. They went from the run or on position to the cutoff position, off, which means essentially the fuel supply to both engines stopped midair right after takeoff. And what's really crucial here, these are independent switches, two separate actions. And the report says they were moved with only a 1-second gap between them. 1 second.
Wow. And the consequence, obviously catastrophic. The plane started descending almost immediately. I hadn't even cleared the airport boundary yet. The ram air turbine, the RAT, that's the emergency power unit, it deployed at 13:38.47.
Right, it's supposed to give you emergency hydraulic power.
But at that altitude, so low, the power it generated just wasn't enough. Not nearly enough.
And then comes this. This really eerie conversation fragment reported from the cockpit voice recorder. With both engines out, the report says one pilot asked the other, quote, "Why did you cut off?" referring to the fuel switch. And the reply from the other pilot was just, quote, "I did not do so."
Okay, let's really dig into that conversation. It's quoted as just that one exchange. It feels incredibly incomplete, doesn't it?
It does. Very incomplete.
It doesn't say which pilot asked, who responded, if anything else was said. Nothing. So, I mean, what does that immediately make you think? Was it deliberate? An accident? A malfunction? This one line seems to be carrying a lot of weight.
Exactly. It's unsettling how much rests on such a tiny snippet of dialogue. It leaves so many questions hanging. Was it one of the pilots taking deliberate action? Or maybe an accidental flick of the switch? Seems unlikely, but you have to ask. Or perhaps was there some kind of underlying fault? A design issue, a maintenance problem that caused those switches to, register as off or even move. This single exchange, as presented, is really the absolute core of the mystery right now.
So let's look at the theories. One that gained traction pretty fast was the idea of pilot suicide. that maybe one pilot deliberately caused the crash, perhaps due to personal issues. And the people who lean towards this theory, they point to that specific phrasing. Why did you cut off?
The direct accusation.
Exactly. They argue, look, if it was an accident or a system failure, you'd probably say, what happened or why did that happen? Not point the finger directly like that.
Okay, it's a point, but there are some pretty big counter-arguments, aren't there? First off, the immediate denial. I did not do so. If someone intended suicide, why deny it right at that moment?
Good point.
And maybe even more telling, why then apparently allow both switches to be turned back on just seconds later? Because the data suggests an attempt was made to restart.
Right, that doesn't fit the suicide narrative at all.
Yeah.
And then there's their track records. The captain, hugely experienced, over 15,000 hours, apparently was looking forward to retirement. The co-pilot, also a clean record, over 3,400 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And according to reports, like from India Today, neither had any known mental health struggles. They both passed the breathalyzer.
Yeah.
And their actions, trying to re-engage the switches within about 10 seconds, that strongly suggests they wanted to save the plane, not crash it.
It really does. And this is maybe the most crucial detail of all from the report's phrasing. It assumes the pilots turned off the switches. It never explicitly states, based on direct evidence, pilot A moved switch 1.
It's an interpretation.
It's presented as an interpretation or perhaps an assumption based on the switch position data, but that assumption is doing a lot of work in leading towards the pilot error conclusion.
Okay, so if we sort of tentatively set aside the intentional act theory, what about an accident? Just, brushing past the switches.
Well, the report itself says that's nearly impossible.
Nearly impossible. Why so definite? What's the mechanism?
Because these aren't like light switches you can just flick. They have a built-in safety feature, a stop lock mechanism. You physically have to pull the switch up first against a spring or lock and then move it to the cutoff position.
Oh, okay.
So just brushing past them, even a solid bump, shouldn't change the position. It requires a deliberate two-step action. And when you think about two switches being moved, one right after the other, an accidental brush seems even more improbable.
Plus, pilots have incredibly strict procedures, right?
Mhm.
Standard operating procedures, SOP.
Extremely strict.
And these fuel switches, they're normally only touched on the ground.
Correct. For starting the engines before departure or shutting them down after landing and parking.
In flight, they stay firmly in the run position.
Unless there's a very specific, serious emergency, like maybe an engine fire or a severe malfunction where you might, under checklist guidance, shut one down.
But even then, there's a whole process, isn't there?
Yeah.
They talk about it, confirm, make sure they're at a safe altitude.
Absolutely. It's a coordinated, deliberate action following a checklist, shutting them both off immediately after takeoff, even in response to, say, an engine fire warning.
Right.
That's just not standard procedure. It's virtually unheard of.
Okay, so if it wasn't deliberate and it likely wasn't an accidental touch, what's left?
Well, this is where some senior pilots started raising other possibilities. Could it have been some kind of electrical fault? Or maybe a software glitch where the system indicated the switches were at cutoff even if they physically weren't? Or maybe a fault caused them to move?
Like a false reading confusing the pilots or something actively malfunctioning.
It's theoretically possible. It could potentially explain the pilot's denial, I didn't do it, because they genuinely didn't physically move the switch themselves.
And this is where things get really interesting. Connecting to something outside the immediate crash investigation. We need to talk about a specific document. A Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, an SAIB. This was issued by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, way back on December 17, 2018.
Yes, this is potentially critical. This FAA bulletin highlighted that operators of Boeing 737s were reporting problems, specifically problems with a disengaged locking feature on their fuel control switches.
The exact mechanism we were just talking about.
The exact one, meaning the switch position could potentially be changed without that deliberate pull-up action first. This suddenly makes an accidental activation, while still maybe unlikely, seem a bit more plausible than nearly impossible.
And the absolutely crucial part.
The Boeing 787, the same type of aircraft as the Air India plane, was included in that bulletin. It was listed among the aircraft potentially affected by these faulty switches.
So the FAA knew about this potential issue on the 787 back in 2018. What did they recommend?
They recommended that owners, the airlines, inspect these switches. Check for this disengaged locking feature, and if they found the problem, replace the switches.
Okay, standard enough, but here's the kicker.
Here's the kicker. According to reports, Air India did not conduct this specific inspection on this aircraft. Or perhaps fleet-wide, we need more clarity there.
Why not?
Their reported reasoning was that it was only an advisory bulletin from the FAA, not a mandatory airworthiness directive. So technically optional.
Optional safety checks on fuel cutoff switches.
That seems to be the implication. Now, the report does state the plane's throttle control module, the whole unit housing these switches, was changed twice in 2019 and 2023. But it also explicitly states these replacements were for other reasons and had nothing to do with checking or rectifying this specific potential fuel switch issue flagged by the FAA.
So that leaves a massive question mark hanging there, doesn't it?
A huge one. Could this unaddressed issue, flagged years earlier by the FAA for this exact aircraft type, be a contributing factor, or even the root cause? It hasn't been ruled out, but the preliminary report seems to steer away from it.
Which brings us back to critically looking at the AAIB's preliminary report itself.
Exactly. The fact that they quote only that single ambiguous line of pilot conversation and seem to use it to heavily imply pilot blame, well, it naturally raises questions about transparency, doesn't it?
Definitely. They must have the full recording from the cockpit voice recorder, the black box.
They do. International protocols ensure that.
So why not release the full relevant transcript? Or at least more context?
The Airline Pilots Association of India certainly picked up on this. They openly questioned if the investigation's tone and focus were biased towards pilot error right from the start.
And it wasn't just the pilot union.
No, even Air Marshal Sanjeev Kapoor, he's the Director General of the Indian Air Force for Inspection and Flight Safety, a very senior figure. He publicly challenged the report's implication. He questioned the likelihood of both fuel switches on a 787 being turned off within just 1 second of each other by pilot action.
What was his alternative theory?
He suggested it was more likely the engines themselves failed somehow just after takeoff, and the pilots were actually trying to restart them, following emergency procedures which might involve manipulating those switches. A completely different scenario.
So this preliminary report, it came out quickly, within 30 days of the crash on June 12th.
Yes, as per international guidelines for preliminary reports.
But those guidelines also say these reports are not meant to assign blame or liability. They're for sharing initial facts.
Correct. The real analysis, the conclusions, the probable cause that's supposed to come in the final detailed report.
Which is due within a year, so sometime by mid-2025.
Hopefully. And the big hope is that the full cockpit conversation, or at least a much fuller contextualized version, will be made public then. That might allow for a proper understanding of what really happened in those final moments.
You know, it kind of reminds you of other complex investigations, doesn't it? Like that Boeing 737 crash in China back in March 2022.
Yes, the China Eastern flight. A truly baffling crash, that vertical dive.
Killed everyone on board. And even now, over 3 years later, the investigation is reportedly finished.
But the Chinese government cited national security concerns.
And chose not to release the findings publicly. The full truth remains hidden.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, how vital transparency is in these situations, not just for the families, but for aviation safety globally, and what can happen when that transparency is missing.
So after all this, we're left with these layers, these multiple possibilities all swirling around. Was it deliberate pilot action? Seems less likely, given the evidence, but not entirely dismissed by the report. Was it a freak, 1 in a million accidental touch? The mechanism makes that hard, but maybe not impossible if that FAA bulletin is relevant. Or was it a critical mechanical failure, an electrical glitch, maybe even a software issue, potentially linked back to that known but apparently unaddressed switch problem?
Yeah, this deep dive really just underscores how incredibly complex these investigations are and how those initial findings, like in this preliminary report, can sometimes create more questions than they actually answer. The incompleteness of that reported conversation, the pilot's denial, their solid records, and then the existence of that very specific FAA bulletin.
Right.
It all paints a much, much more complicated picture than just saying pilot error.
It suggests we need to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
Extremely cautious. Thoroughness has to trump speed when the stakes are this high.
So as we wait for that final, conclusive report, maybe here's something for you, our listeners, to think about. In this world we live in now, with ever-increasing automation and these incredibly complex technological systems in planes, cars, everywhere, what's the right balance? How much accountability should really fall on the human operators versus the designers, the manufacturers, the maintenance crews?
Especially when critical safety warnings, like that FAA bulletin, are sometimes treated as merely optional advice rather than mandatory actions.
What part of this whole unfolding story stands out most to you? We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive today.